The desperate choice. Emma Chen sat in her Manhattan apartment, the city lights glowing far below her window like scattered diamonds across black velvet. From the outside, everything about her life looked perfect. At just 29, she had climbed to the position of marketing director at Pinnacle Advertising, one of New York's most prestigious firms. People looked at her and saw success, glamorous, sharp, driven, independent. But when Emma looked in the mirror that night, smoothing down the emerald silk dress she had carefully chosen for the charity gala, she saw something different. She saw a woman who had sacrificed nearly everything, relationships, friendships, even her health, for her career. Her parents, immigrants who had worked long hours in a Chinatown bakery to give her opportunities, were proud of her. But they didn't see the exhaustion in her eyes or the loneliness that clung to her like a shadow. The gala was supposed to be her moment. Richard Hampton, the powerful CEO of Pinnacle, had reminded her again and again that evening was crucial. The Hartwell Foundation, one of the wealthiest philanthropic organizations in the country, was considering signing a multi-million-dollar campaign deal. If Emma impressed them, she could finally secure a partnership, something she had dreamed of since her very first day at Pinnacle. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. Another message from Hampton. Emma, remember tonight is crucial. The board will be watching. And remember, you're representing Pinnacle. Appearances matter. Appearances. That word cut deeper than he probably realized. For months, Emma had been subtly reminded that her image mattered as much as her skills. At high society galas like this one, her male colleagues always showed up with glamorous dates, models, actresses, or women whose presence alone seemed to open doors. Emma, on the other hand, usually arrived, yet alone, clutching her champagne flute like a shield against whispers. And though no one said it outright, she knew what Hampton expected. A charming companion, he had told her with that sharp look, the one that left no room for excuses. But Emma had no one. Her last relationship had collapsed under the weight of her endless late nights at the office. Friends had slowly drifted away, tired of her constant cancellations. And dating apps? She had no time, no energy, and no patience for shallow conversations. That was why, 3 days ago, in a moment of desperation, Emma had done something that both terrified and embarrassed her. She had made a call, not to a friend, not to an old flame, but to an agency, an escort agency. Her chest tightened even thinking about it. She had told herself it was purely business, a one-night arrangement. She needed someone polished, confident, presentable, a man who could help her make the right impression at the gala. No one had to know. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about companionship. It was about survival in a ruthless industry that demanded perfection from women while excusing the flaws of men. Emma tried to steady her breathing. It's just one night, she reminded herself. No one will ever know. He'll show up, play the role, and then disappear. That's it. But deep down, she felt shame mixed with something else. Fear. Fear that she had let herself sink so low. Fear that maybe her entire life was nothing but a performance. The knock on her door came exactly at 7, sharp, deliberate, almost commanding. Emma froze, her heart hammering. She hesitated for a full 5 seconds before finally forcing herself to move. When she opened the door, she expected someone ordinary, handsome maybe, polished probably, but ordinary. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who seemed anything but ordinary. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. His hair was dark, cut neatly, but there was a natural wave to it that gave him a slightly rebellious edge. His jawline was strong, his eyes an intense shade of gray that seemed to see far more than she wanted anyone to see. For a moment, Emma forgot how to breathe. "Miss Chen?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. She nodded quickly, gathering herself. "Yes, come in." The man stepped inside, his presence filling the apartment effortlessly. He moved with quiet confidence, not the kind that shouted, but the kind that commanded attention without trying. "I'm Alexander," he said, extending a hand. Emma shook it. His grip was firm, warm, but not overbearing. Something about him unsettled her, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that made her suddenly aware of herself, of her dress, of her choices. She cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Alexander gave a small, almost amused smile. "That's what I'm here for." Emma tried to ignore the strange flutter in her chest. This was business. Just business. Yet as she glanced at him again, she couldn't shake the thought that there was something unusual about him. His suit wasn't just expensive, it was custom. His watch wasn't flashy, but it was the kind only someone with wealth or remarkable taste would own. And his posture, calm, controlled, as if he belonged anywhere and everywhere, didn't quite match the role she had hired him for. Still, she pushed the doubts aside. Tonight, she needed a partner, not a mystery. "Shall we?" Alexander asked, offering his arm. Emma hesitated, then slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. His presence was steady, grounding, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. As they stepped into the night, the city stretched out before them, bright, cold, and unforgiving. Emma had no idea that her decision, made in desperation, would change everything. That the man beside her was not who he claimed to be. And that by the end of this night, her carefully constructed life would never be the same. The stranger arrives. The black town car glided smoothly through the streets of Manhattan, its tinted windows shielding Emma and Alexander from the bustling chaos of the Friday evening crowd. Inside, the glow from the city lights spilled across the leather interior, creating a quiet cocoon where Emma found herself hyper-aware of the man seated beside her. She tried to keep her gaze fixed on the passing skyscrapers, but her eyes kept drifting back to him, studying the ease with which he sat, relaxed yet alert, shoulders straight, one hand resting casually on his knee. There was no nervousness, no forced charm, none of the traits she had expected from someone playing the role of a hired companion. Instead, there was a quiet composure, a sense of someone entirely at home in his skin. Emma adjusted the hem of her dress, suddenly self-conscious. She had told herself this arrangement was strictly professional, but with every passing second she became more aware of the risk she was taking. What if he said something inappropriate at the gala? What if he didn't blend in? What if her colleagues saw through the performance? Richard Hampton had a way of sniffing out weakness, and if he discovered she had gone so far as to hire someone for appearance's sake, her career would be over before it reached its peak. Yet when Alexander turned his head toward her, his gray eyes catching the light for just a moment, she felt an inexplicable steadiness. His presence was not the burden she had feared, it was strangely reassuring. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice carrying that same calm timbre as when he introduced himself at her door. He didn't ask with mockery or judgment, but with genuine observation, as if he had already read the tension in her posture. Emma hesitated before answering, not wanting to reveal too much of her vulnerability, but something in his tone disarmed her. "A little," she admitted, folding her hands in her lap. "Tonight is important." "Then we'll make sure it goes well," Alexander replied simply, as though success were not just possible but inevitable. He didn't shower her with compliments or empty reassurances. Instead, his words carried a quiet confidence that made Emma feel, for the first time in weeks, that maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone. She studied him more closely then, noting how his watch gleamed subtly in the dim light. It wasn't ostentatious, but she recognized the brand from one of her past clients. It was the kind of watch executives and hedge fund managers wore, not escorts. She considered asking about it, about him, about why he carried himself with such authority, but she stopped herself. It didn't matter who he really was. For tonight, he was Alexander, her partner, her shield against the whispers and stares of an unforgiving world. She didn't need his life story. She needed his presence, his polish, and his ability to play the role. Anything beyond that was dangerous ground. The car pulled up to the entrance of the Metropolis Grand, where the gala was being hosted. Cameras flashed as other guests in glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos walked up the marble steps. The Hartwell Foundation never did anything halfway. Their events were a swirl of power brokers, celebrities, and philanthropists whose donations bought them influence in circles most people could only dream of entering. Emma's throat tightened as the car door opened, and the sound of clicking heels, laughter, and camera shutters filled the air. For a moment, she considered shrinking back, wishing she could vanish into anonymity. Then Alexander stepped out first, straightening his jacket with fluid precision before turning to offer his hand to her. She looked at him, at the faint, almost imperceptible curve of confidence on his lips, and something in her shifted. She placed her hand in his, and the firm steadiness of his grip pulled her back into herself. As she rose from the car, cameras swung in her direction, but instead of panic, she felt an odd sense of poise. Together they ascended the steps, and with every flash of light she could almost believe she belonged there. Inside, the ballroom was a world of opulence. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light over white linen tables, champagne glasses clinking, the low murmur of powerful conversations filling the air. Emma spotted Richard Hampton near the stage, already laughing too loudly with board members, his arms slung around the shoulders of another executive. He hadn't noticed her yet, but he would, and when he did, she knew he'd be evaluating every detail. Alexander leaned down slightly as they entered the crowd. "Breathe," he murmured. "You're not here to survive tonight, you're here to shine." Emma nearly laughed at the audacity of his words, but instead she inhaled deeply, straightened her shoulders, and allowed herself to move with him through the room. People turned as they passed, not just because of her emerald dress, but because of the way Alexander carried himself, the way he seemed to radiate quiet authority. Colleagues greeted her with polite smiles, some with surprise at the presence of her companion, but no one questioned it. If anything, their eyes flicked curiously toward Alexander, as though trying to place him. At one point, a junior executive she barely knew whispered, "Wow, Emma, where did you find him?" The tone was light, but there was a trace of envy in it. For once, Emma didn't feel like she was being judged for arriving alone. She didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. But beneath the smooth surface of the evening, Emma's instincts buzzed with unease. Alexander was too composed, too natural in this environment. He wasn't fumbling over etiquette. He wasn't overwhelmed by the glitter of wealth. He belonged here. More than that, he commanded it. Every time he spoke, people listened, leaning in as though his words carried weight. And every so often, she caught him observing the room with a sharpness that went beyond idle curiosity. He wasn't just present. He was calculating, assessing, as if every face and gesture meant something to him. Emma excused herself briefly to collect a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She needed the fizz against her tongue to calm her racing mind. What had she gotten herself into? Who exactly was this man? She had ordered an escort, and instead she had been given, what? Someone who seemed less like a hired companion and more like a power broker in disguise. It was absurd to imagine, but as she glanced across the room and saw him standing tall in a circle of executives speaking with effortless gravitas, the thought struck her like lightning. He could be one of them. Shaking her head, she forced herself to dismiss the idea. No, that was ridiculous. She had paid an agency. Agencies didn't send billionaires in disguise. And yet the longer the night unfolded, the harder it became to ignore the gnawing suspicion that nothing about Alexander was ordinary. And Emma Chen, whose life until now had been a carefully controlled climb up the corporate ladder, had no idea that her first step into this gala was also her first step into a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about success, about power, and about love. Unmasking hints. The evening wore on with the rhythm of a carefully choreographed performance. Waiters glided between tables carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and the gilded chandeliers above threw golden light across gowns that shimmered like liquid under the glow. Emma had attended countless corporate events, but tonight felt different, not because of the setting, but because of the man at her side. From the moment they entered the ballroom, Alexander had been more than just a silent escort. He had become a presence that altered the very atmosphere around her. She felt it when people turned their heads as they walked by, when conversations paused ever so slightly as he entered a circle, And when eyes lingered on him with curiosity, trying to place who he might be. At first, Emma told herself she was imagining it. Of course, people would look at him. He was striking, poised, impossible not to notice. But the longer she observed, the clearer it became that it wasn't simply his looks drawing attention. It was the way he engaged. Unlike many of the polished socialites floating through the room, Alexander didn't chatter mindlessly or flatter for the sake of it. When he spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, and carried with them a subtle authority. Executives who normally brushed Emma aside as a junior player now stood with her longer than usual, partly to hear Alexander's responses, partly because his presence seemed to elevate her in their eyes. Emma felt torn between relief and unease. On one hand, Alexander was helping her exactly as she had hoped. Her confidence grew with every passing moment as she saw colleagues and rivals alike reassessing her with newfound respect. For once, she wasn't the woman awkwardly erring at the edge of conversations, unmasking hints. The evening wore on with the rhythm of a carefully choreographed performance. Waiters glided between tables carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and the gilded chandeliers above threw golden light across gowns that shimmered like liquid under the glow. Emma had attended countless corporate events, but tonight felt different, not because of the setting, but because of the man at her side. From the moment they entered the ballroom, Alexander had been more than just a silent escort. He had become a presence that altered the very atmosphere around her. She felt it when people turned their heads as they walked by, when conversations paused ever so slightly as he entered a circle, and when eyes lingered on him with curiosity, trying to place who he might be. At first, Emma told herself she was imagining it. Of course people would look at him. He was striking, poised, impossible not to notice. But the longer she observed, the clearer it became that it wasn't simply his looks drawing attention. It was the way he engaged. Unlike many of the polished socialites floating through the room, Alexander didn't chatter mindlessly or flatter for the sake of it. When he spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, and carried with them a subtle authority. Executives who normally brushed Emma aside as a junior player now stood with her longer than usual, partly to hear Alexander's responses, partly because his presence seemed to elevate her in their eyes. Emma felt torn between relief and unease. On one hand, Alexander was helping her exactly as she had hoped. Her confidence grew with every passing moment as she saw colleagues and rivals alike reassessing her with newfound respect. For once, she wasn't the woman awkwardly hovering at the edge of conversations. She was at the center of them, standing tall beside a mall, and who exuded influence. Yet on the other hand, the disconnect between who he was supposed to be and who he appeared to be gnawed at her. She had ordered an escort to play a part, but Alexander wasn't playing. He was inhabiting a role far larger than the one she had paid for. The first true crack in her assumption came when they were introduced to Charles Remington, a hedge fund titan with a reputation for being as ruthless as he was wealthy. Hampton had warned her in advance that winning Remington's favor would be vital. Emma braced herself as she stepped forward, preparing to make her carefully rehearsed pitch about Pinnacle's marketing strategies. But before she could even begin, Remington's sharp eyes flicked over her shoulder to Alexander, narrowing slightly as if recognizing him. "And you are?" Remington asked, extending a hand. His tone was clipped, not dismissive but curious, the way one might address an equal rather than a stranger. Alexander shook his hand firmly. "Just here as Emma's guest," he said with a faint smile that revealed nothing. Remington studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost respectful nod before turning back to Emma. "Well, if your judgment in companions is this good, perhaps your judgment in strategy will match it. I look forward to your presentation." As Remington walked away, Emma's mind spun. Why would one of the most powerful men in finance look at a supposed escort with that kind of recognition? And why had Alexander handled the interaction with such effortless diplomacy, offering just enough to satisfy without actually answering the question? Later, when they found themselves momentarily alone near the refreshment table, Emma lowered her voice. "Do you know Charles Remington?" she asked carefully, trying to sound casual. Alexander glanced at her, his gray eyes steady. "We've crossed paths," he said. His answer was deliberately vague, a door left half open, and then he shifted the subject with smooth precision. You handled that introduction well. He respects confidence. Emma pressed her lips together, frustration mingling with curiosity. She wanted to demand clarity, but something stopped her. There was a subtle warning in his eyes, as though pressing further would lead her into territory she wasn't ready for. Instead, she took a sip of champagne, letting the bubbles distract her from the growing list of questions she didn't dare ask. The second hint came when Richard Hampton finally noticed her. He approached with his usual air of superiority, his smile wide but his eyes sharp as blades. "Emma," he drawled, patting her arm with faux warmth. "I see you've finally learned how to arrive properly." His gaze flicked briefly to Alexander, and Emma braced for a cutting remark. Instead, Hampton hesitated. It was only a second, but in that pause she saw something she had never seen in him before. Calculation. "And you are?" Hampton asked, his voice edged with curiosity. "Alexander," came the simple reply. Hampton tilted his head slightly, studying him with the caution of a man who suddenly realizes he might be under scrutiny himself. Then, with a thin smile, he nodded. "Well, Emma, I must say you've outdone yourself tonight. Very impressive." And just like that, he was gone, slipping back into the crowd before she could even respond. Emma's chest tightened. Hampton had never once complimented her presence at these events. For years, he had made her feel like an accessory to the company's ambitions, useful but replaceable. Yet tonight, with Alexander at her side, Hampton had not only acknowledged her but praised her. She didn't know whether to feel triumphant or unsettled. The third, and perhaps most unsettling hint arrived later in the evening when Emma stepped aside for a moment of quiet near the balcony. She needed air, needed distance from the whirl of champagne and polite smiles. Alexander joined her, leaning against the railing as they looked out at the glittering sprawl of Manhattan. For a while they were silent, the city stretching endlessly beneath them. "You belong here," Alexander said finally, his tone matter-of-fact. Emma gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "I've spent years trying to prove that, but some days I'm not so sure." "You don't need to prove it to anyone," he replied. "Not Hampton, not Remington, not even yourself. The way you carry yourself tonight speaks louder than any title could." His words hit her harder than she expected. No one, not her parents, not her colleagues, not even past partners, had ever spoken to her with that kind of certainty. It wasn't flattery, it was conviction. She turned to look at him, searching his face for some clue, some indication of why a man hired for one night would speak as though he understood her deepest insecurities. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed a depth that unsettled her. It was as if he had stood where she stood, as if he knew what it meant to fight for a place in rooms that weren't built to welcome you. Emma shivered, not from the chill of the night, but from the realization that this man was far more than the role he was playing. For the first time, the possibility truly took root in her mind. Alexander was hiding something, and if her instincts were right, whatever he was hiding had the power to upend everything she thought she knew about this evening, about her career, and perhaps even about her own life. The test of dignity. The evening had reached that delicate point where masks began to slip. The champagne had loosened tongues, the air hummed with half-hidden rivalries, and conversations grew sharper as alliances and enmities revealed themselves beneath the polished surface. Emma, who had been moving from one circle of conversation to another, found herself drawn into a cluster of colleagues near the central stage, and the men dominated the space with their booming voices, trading market gossip and subtle power jabs, while the women, though elegant and brilliant in their own right, were expected to play the role of ornament more than equal. Emma had lived this imbalance for years, smiling tightly through patronizing comments, offering ideas only to have them repeated louder by men who claimed them as their own. She had learned to navigate it with grace, but tonight, perhaps because Alexander stood at her side, her patience was thinner than usual. It began innocently enough. A senior partner, Wallace Green, turned to Emma with the sort of smile that never reached his eyes. He was known for his sharp wit, but also for the cruelty hidden beneath it, the kind that left scars invisible to the naked eye. Emma, he said, lifting his glass. You've done well for yourself tonight. I suppose having such a striking companion must help with confidence, His words were smooth, but the implication was sharp, that her presence tonight was valuable not because of her intellect, not because of her years of relentless work, but because she had chosen the right man to stand beside her. The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was enough to sting. Emma felt her face flush, the shame prickling like heat across her skin. She had expected comments, but hearing it spoken so openly, in front of colleagues she had fought so hard to impress, ignited a fury deep inside her. She opened her mouth, ready to defend herself, but before she could speak, Alexander stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice or offer any grand performance. Instead, he spoke with a calm firmness that cut through the laughter like a blade. Confidence, Alexander said, his gaze fixed on Green, is not borrowed from the company one keeps. It's built over years of hard work and results. Emma has proven herself in this industry again and again, while many of us, he paused deliberate, letting the words linger, still ride the comfort of old reputations. The circle fell silent. For a moment no one moved, as if unsure how to respond. Green's smile faltered, his cheeks reddening, but he said nothing. And in that silence, Emma felt something shift. It wasn't just that Alexander had defended her, it was how he had done it. He hadn't spoken as a man paid to play a role. He had spoken as someone who knew her worth, someone unafraid to challenge arrogance with truth. The silence broke with a forced chuckle from another executive, eager to smooth over the tension. Well said, he offered, clinking his glass as if to dismiss the moment. Conversation picked up again, but Emma's heart was still pounding. She looked at Alexander, her mind racing. Who was this man who could silence one of the most ruthless partners in the firm with a single measured statement? Who was he to speak with such authority, as if he belonged in this room of titans and power brokers? Later, when they drifted away from the group and found themselves near the silent auction displays, Emma turned to him. Her voice was quiet, edged with equal parts gratitude and suspicion. You didn't have to do that. Alexander's expression softened, but his eyes remained steady. Yes, I did. People like Green mistake cruelty for cleverness. Sometimes they need reminding that dignity matters more than performance. Emma searched his face, caught between admiration and unease. She had spent years defending herself in rooms like this, swallowing pride in the name of survival, enduring slights because she believed that was the cost of climbing the ladder. And yet here was this man, this supposed escort, standing beside her, refusing to let her be diminished. The question she had tried to suppress since he arrived returned stronger than ever. Why was he here? As the gala moved toward its climax with speeches and toasts, Emma found herself replaying the moment in her mind. Every time her gaze landed on Alexander, she saw layers peeling back, revealing not just mystery, but conviction. He wasn't here merely to impress or to charm. He carried himself like a man with principles, a man accustomed to being heard, a man unafraid of confrontation, even in a room filled with power. The thought unsettled her because it didn't fit with the narrative she had built to justify his presence. When Richard Hampton finally took the stage to give his address, Emma listened half-heartedly, her mind elsewhere. Hampton spoke in the same booming, self-assured cadence he always used, his words filled with rehearsed charm about charity and community. Yet Emma noticed something she had never seen before. Hampton's eyes darted occasionally toward Alexander, as though measuring him, as though wary of an unknown rival. It struck her then that she wasn't the only one unsettled by Alexander's presence. Even the man who held her career in his hands seemed thrown off balance. After the speeches, when the crowd thinned toward the dance floor, Emma felt a weight press against her chest. She excused herself to the balcony again, needing air, needing distance. Alexander followed, not imposing, but present, as though he understood her need without words. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint hum of traffic below. For a long time they stood in silence, the city sprawling endlessly beneath them. Finally, Emma turned to him, her voice low but steady. You aren't who you say you are. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, born of instinct and confirmed by everything she had seen tonight. His silence in response was not denial, it was acknowledgement. And though he offered no explanation, no confession, the truth hung between them like the chill in the air. Emma's heart pounded as she looked into his gray eyes. She had invited a stranger into her life for one night, a man she thought would play a simple role. Instead, she had opened the door to someone who carried secrets powerful enough to unsettle titans, silence cruelty, and make even her arrogant boss hesitate. She didn't know yet if that truth would save her or destroy her, but she knew one thing for certain. The man she had met tonight was not an escort, and whatever he was about to change everything. The revelation, the gala had reached its crescendo. The orchestra swelled as couples moved gracefully across the polished dance floor, the laughter and clinking of glasses rising above the music like waves against the shore. Emma stood near the edge of the room, the soft fabric of her emerald dress brushing against her legs as she tried to steady herself. Her mind was no longer on the charity speeches, the foundation's promises, or even the potential contracts that could secure her promotion. Every thought, every fragment of focus, kept circling back to the man at her side. Alexander. Since his arrival, her world had tilted. He was not the escort she had summoned in desperation, that much she knew now. His ease among billionaires, his ability to silence arrogance with one phrase, the recognition in Remington's eyes, the wary glances from Hampton, none of it aligned with the role he was supposed to play. The question that pressed heavier with each passing moment was not simply who he was, but why he had agreed to come here under such a disguise. As she stood in silence, Alexander appeared at her side again, his presence as steady as ever. "You're distracted," he observed, his voice low, warm, and without judgment. Emma turned to him, her frustration finally spilling past the wall she had tried to hold up. "Of course I'm distracted. You walk into this room and command it as if you own it. People who've ignored me for years suddenly take notice because of you. And you're not who you say you are. So tell me, Alexander, who exactly are you?" He met her gaze, unflinching, but his silence stretched long enough to make her chest tighten. Then finally, he spoke. "Tonight was about you, not me. That's all that matters." The answer only deepened the storm inside her. It was deliberate evasion, the kind given by people with something to hide. Yet before she could press further, a commotion stirred near the stage. Richard Hampton had taken the microphone again, his booming voice calling for attention as he prepared to announce the evening's closing highlight, the auction results and recognition of the foundation's most significant new donors. Emma, still unsettled, turned her eyes reluctantly toward the stage. "And now," Hampton declared with theatrical flourish, "we have the pleasure of acknowledging an extraordinary commitment to the Hartwell Foundation, a contribution that will ensure new schools and hospitals are built across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing the generosity of tonight's most significant benefactor, Alexander Reed." The ballroom erupted in applause. Emma froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the words echoed in her mind. Alexander Reed. Not just Alexander, Reed. The name was familiar, almost painfully so, because it belonged to one of the most elusive and powerful figures in the country. Alexander Reed, the reclusive billionaire CEO of Reed Global Enterprises, a man whose decisions shifted markets and whose fortune had been the subject of countless articles and whispered speculation. He rarely appeared in public, and when he did, it was at closed-door gatherings where the elite mingled with their own. And now he was standing beside her, the man she had mistaken for an escort, the man she had unknowingly invited into her world under false assumptions. The applause continued as heads turned, faces alight with recognition, and conversations buzzed in disbelief. Emma felt her knees weaken as she realized every set of eyes would soon be on them. Slowly, Alexander inclined his head in acknowledgement, offering no grand speech, only a measured smile. When the clapping subsided, he returned to her side as though nothing had changed. "You," Emma began, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and fury. "You're Alexander Reed? You let me believe—" She cut herself off, her words choking in her throat. A wave of humiliation washed over her as the implications crashed down. She had hired an escort, and instead of a stranger playing a role, she had invited one of the most powerful men in the country into her life, under the assumption that he was disposable, temporary, anonymous. Emma's face burned as she imagined what her colleagues must think. To them, it would look as if she had known all along, as if she had arrived arm in arm with a billionaire benefactor by design. Richard Hampton's calculating stare from across the room confirmed her fear. To him, she would appear manipulative, opportunistic, perhaps even deceitful. She turned on Alexander, her voice low but sharp. "Why would you do this? Why would a man like you show up at my door pretending to be someone else?" Alexander's expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, something almost vulnerable. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "the only way to know if someone sees you for who you are is to step outside of the title that defines you. Tonight, I wanted to see what it meant to be just Alexander." His words, though earnest, only deepened the chaos in her chest. She had no space for riddles, no patience for mysteries cloaked in humility. The stakes of her career, her reputation, her very identity in this ruthless world had been thrown into turmoil by his presence. "Do you have any idea what this could cost me?" she whispered, her voice trembling now, not just with anger but with fear. "I built my career brick by brick. I've clawed my way into rooms where no one wanted me. And tonight was supposed to be my chance to prove I belong here. Instead, you turned me into a spectacle." Alexander studied her, his jaw tightening slightly. "No, Emma, you did that yourself, long before I arrived. Tonight, you stood tall against their doubt. You carried yourself with grace in a room full of people who would have gladly diminished you. Don't let my name take away from what you've earned." But Emma couldn't hear the compliment in his words. All she felt was the sting of betrayal. She needed control, and he had taken it from her with one revelation. The weight of the night pressed down on her shoulders, and though the ballroom around them buzzed with admiration for the billionaire's unexpected appearance, Emma felt like the ground beneath her was giving way. She turned away, struggling to keep her composure. The city lights glimmered beyond the tall windows, and for the first time in years, she felt utterly lost. She had invited a stranger into her life for one night, and in return, she had been pulled into a story she had never asked for, one that would test not just her career, but her very sense of dignity and trust. And though she didn't know it yet, the revelation of Alexander's true identity was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning of a transformation that would force her to redefine success, power, and the meaning of love itself. The turning point. The ballroom had begun to blur into a whirl of voices, laughter, and shifting shadows. Emma stood at the edge of it all, her heart pounding as though it wanted to break free from her chest. The name still rang in her ears: Alexander Reed, billionaire, CEO, power broker, the kind of man who could shape industries with a single decision. And she, Emma Chen, had invited him into her home, thinking he was just an escort filling a temporary void in her carefully controlled life. The humiliation of it burned her from the inside out, not because she had misjudged him, but because of what it might now look like to everyone else. To Richard Hampton, to her colleagues, to the foundation donors who had already been circling her like hawks, waiting for one misstep. She excused herself abruptly from the crowd and pushed her way toward the balcony again, desperate for air. The cool night met her like a slap, the hum of the city below grounding her in its restless pulse. She leaned against the stone railing, her fingers tightening until her knuckles whitened. For years, she had endured every slight, every subtle dismissal, every test of patience because she believed she was working toward something greater. And now, in one night, all of it felt at risk, not because of a mistake she had made, but because of a truth she had never been allowed to see until it was forced on her. Alexander followed her a few moments later. He didn't rush, didn't try to overwhelm her with explanations. He simply appeared, his footsteps soft against the marble floor, and leaned against the railing a short distance away. For a time they stood in silence, the city spread before them like an ocean of light. "You're angry," he said finally, his tone calm but edged with something more serious. Emma turned on him, her voice sharp. "Angry? You let me walk into this night blind. You let me think you were someone else entirely, and now everyone in that room believes I've been scheming, that I somehow planned to show up with Alexander Reed on my arm. Do you know what that makes me look like?" Alexander's gaze held steady, his gray eyes reflecting the city lights. "Do you care so much about what they think?" Of course I care, she snapped, her chest rising and falling with the force of her words. My entire career depends on what they think. Every step I've taken has been judged, dissected, dismissed, and I've had to fight for scraps of respect. And tonight I was supposed to prove I belonged there, not because of who was standing beside me, but because of who I am. Her voice broke on the last words, the frustration spilling into raw pain. Alexander shifted closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough that she could feel the steadiness in his presence. You already proved it, he said softly. You've been proving it every day you've walked into that office, every time you've pushed back against doubt and carried yourself with strength, even when no one gave you credit. Tonight didn't make you who you are, it only revealed what you've already built. Emma shook her head, tears stinging her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Easy for you to say. You live in a world where doors open just because of your name. You've never had to beg to be heard. You've never been told you're only valuable when you're standing next to the right man. For the first time, Alexander's calm faltered. His jaw tightened and his voice dropped lower. You think I've never been dismissed? Never been underestimated? I was told I'd never succeed, that I didn't belong in boardrooms filled with men who had inherited their wealth while I started with nothing but debts and sleepless nights. I know what it means to fight for ground when every step forward feels like a battle. The difference is I refuse to let their judgment define me, and so should you. Emma stared at him, her anger clashing with an unexpected flicker of understanding. Beneath his wealth, beneath the title, there was truth in his words. He had built something from the ground up, clawed his way into circles that had tried to shut him out. But still, she could not shake the sense of betrayal. Then why hide, she demanded. If you wanted to understand me, if you wanted to know what it felt like outside of your title, you should have said so. Instead, you let me walk into this room looking like a fool. Alexander's eyes softened then, and he took a slow breath. I wasn't hiding to deceive you. I was hiding to be seen. Do you know how rare it is for me to meet someone who doesn't measure me by my fortune, my power, or what they can gain from me? For one night, I wanted to be nothing more than a man, and you treated me like one, not because of who I was supposed to be, but because of who you thought I was. Do you have any idea how valuable that is? His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Emma looked away, her mind swirling. She wanted to cling to her anger, to the safe armor of outrage, but something in her chest was cracking. She thought of the way he had silenced Green's cruelty, the way he had guided her through the gala without overshadowing her, the way he had spoken to her on the balcony earlier with conviction that pierced through her doubt. None of that had been performance. That had been real. Still, the wounds of her past, the years of being overlooked, underestimated, diminished, made it hard to trust. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together. Ether, I don't know if I can believe you, she whispered. Alexander stepped closer, his voice low but steady. Then don't believe me. Believe yourself. Believe in the woman who walked into that ballroom tonight and carried herself with grace even when the odds were stacked against her. Believe in the woman who didn't need me to define her but shone on her own. Because that woman, Emma Chen, already belongs in every room she enters, and nothing I am or am not can take that away from you. The words settled into her chest, cutting through the noise of doubt like a beam of light. She wanted to resist them, but she couldn't. Deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent so long trying to prove herself to others that she had forgotten the truth she most needed to hold, that her worth was not dependent on their acceptance. It was hers to claim. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched out before them, vast and unyielding, yet in that quiet, Emma felt a shift within her. She was still hurt, still uncertain, but the anger had softened into something else, something like clarity. The man beside her had complicated her life in ways she could not yet untangle, but he had also forced her to face truths she had avoided for far too long. As the sounds of the gala carried faintly through the open doors behind them, Emma knew this night was no longer about contracts or promotions. It was about choice. She could retreat into the safety of bitterness and let fear dictate her next steps, or she could embrace the risk of trusting not just Alexander but herself. And though the decision would not be easy, she knew that this was the turning point. Her life would not be the same after tonight, not because of who he was, but because of who she would choose to become. Transformation Legacy. The gala wound to its inevitable end as the orchestra's music softened into something gentle, the chatter dwindled to goodbyes, and the air of anticipation gave way to the tired satisfaction of an evening well played. Guests drifted out in twos and threes, their laughter echoing faintly as the great hall emptied. For Emma, however, the night did not feel like it was winding down. It felt as though something within her had only just begun to stir awake. She stood once more by the tall windows, the city's unrelenting lights stretching endlessly below, a silent reminder of the millions of lives moving forward, each with their own struggles and triumphs. And she thought of her own path, how often she had mistaken survival for success, silence for strength, endurance for dignity. Alexander stood nearby, his presence no longer a disguise but a revelation. The mask had fallen away, and what remained was a man both extraordinary and startlingly human. He hadn't run after his name was announced, hadn't sought the stage to command the evening, hadn't tried to overshadow her with wealth or power. Instead, he had remained exactly where he was, beside her. It was this, perhaps more than anything else, that began to settle the storm inside her. At last she turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. "So what happens now?" Alexander studied her for a moment before answering. "That depends on you." His words were simple, but beneath them lay a truth that was both terrifying and liberating. He wasn't offering her promises of power or shortcuts to success. He wasn't dangling wealth or opportunity like a prize. He was giving her something far rarer, the space to choose her own path, unshackled from expectation. For years, Emma had measured her life by external validation. Every achievement was weighed against what Hampton thought, what colleagues whispered, what investors valued. Tonight, however, something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was the humiliation that had burned through her pride, or the confrontation on the balcony, or the realization that she had been fighting for scraps of respect from men who would never willingly grant it. Whatever the cause, Emma suddenly knew she didn't want to live bound by those measures anymore. When they returned to the car later that night, the silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken suspicion, but alive with unspoken possibility. Emma leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the blur of neon and steel rush past. She thought of her parents, still working long hours at the bakery, proud of her in ways she had dismissed as too simple to matter. She thought of the younger version of herself, standing nervously on her first day at Pinnacle, clutching a notebook and determined to prove herself worthy. She thought of the woman who had stood in front of a mirror only hours ago, smoothing down her emerald dress while believing she needed a stranger's presence to validate her place in the world. And she realized, with a clarity that pierced through her exhaustion, that she was no longer that woman. The days that followed were not easy. The gossip spread quickly, as it always did in circles where appearances meant everything. Colleagues whispered about Emma arriving with Alexander Reed, speculating endlessly about what it meant. Some painted her as lucky, others as cunning, still others as manipulative. But for the first time in her career, Emma did not bend under the weight of their judgment. Instead, she faced it head-on. In meetings, she spoke with a new steadiness, unafraid of interruptions. When Hampton attempted to make his usual cutting remarks, she countered with facts so sharp he had no choice but to retreat. And when the Hartwell Foundation finalized their contract with Pinnacle, choosing Emma as their direct point of contact, she knew it was because of her work, her vision, and her persistence, not because of anyone standing beside her. Alexander appeared in her life again, not as a mysterious stranger at her door, but as himself, unmasked. Their conversations grew longer, not about wealth or power, but about choices, risks, failures, and the resilience required to rise above them. Emma discovered that beneath the billionaire title was a man who had known struggle in his own way, who understood loneliness despite his influence, and who valued authenticity far more than admiration. And Alexander discovered in Emma someone who saw past the layers of wealth to the core of who he was, a man searching like anyone else for meaning beyond accolades. Their connection grew, not from the spectacle of that night, but from the choices made afterward, moments of honesty, moments of trust, moments where vulnerability was not a weakness, but a bridge. Emma did not need Alexander to rescue her, nor did he ever attempt to. Instead, he reminded her time and again that her strength had always been her own. Months later, as Emma stood on a stage accepting her official partnership at Pinnacle Advertising, she felt the weight of the journey behind her. The applause that filled the room no longer carried the sting of conditional approval. It carried the echo of battles fought and won on her terms. She glanced briefly toward the audience where Alexander sat quietly, watching not as a billionaire accustomed to the spotlight, but as a man proud to see her claim her own. In that moment, Emma understood what had truly changed since the night she opened her door to a stranger. It wasn't simply that she had discovered Alexander's identity. It was that she had discovered her own. She had learned that success was not about who you stood beside, but about who you chose to stand as. She had learned that dignity was not given. It was taken, claimed, and defended. And she had learned that love, when it arrived, was not meant to overshadow or rescue, but to walk alongside as two lives forged something stronger together. The city lights still glimmered far below her window at night, just as they had on that fateful evening. But now, when Emma looked at her reflection in the glass, she didn't see the lonely woman searching for validation. She saw a leader, a partner, a woman who had endured humiliation, betrayal, and doubt, and had transformed them into fuel for greatness. She saw someone who no longer needed to hire the illusion of belonging because she had built it for herself. And though Alexander Reed's name would always carry weight in the world, in her heart he was simply the man who had reminded her of a truth she had always possessed, that the greatest power of all is to know your worth, to claim your place, and to stand in it without apology.